In the amber-lit warmth of Wolfe's Lodge diner, a quietly seated stranger was about to witness an act of cruelty that would demand intervention. What started as an elderly veteran's peaceful dinner turned deadly when an aggressive young thug began his systematic humiliation. Seagal wasn't your typical diner patron. For over 3 decades, he was a legendary martial artist and action star, known for his mastery of Aikido and his ability to neutralize threats without throwing a single punch. When Logan Trent began terrorizing 78-year-old Navy veteran Eli Morgan, he had no idea he was being watched by a master of conflict resolution. Seagal employed a psychological dismantling that would trigger a complete transformation in the young aggressor. What began as harassment of an innocent veteran would become a masterclass in true strength. The mountain community would never be the same after witnessing how real power isn't about dominance. It's about the courage to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Wolfe's Lodge diner sat perched on the mountainside like a beacon against the dying light of autumn. The October sun cast long golden fingers through the windows, painting the rustic wood-paneled walls in warm amber. Outside, the aspens had turned to fire, their leaves dancing on the crisp Colorado air before settling on the gravel parking lot where pickup trucks and weathered sedans clustered like old friends sharing stories. Inside, the evening dinner rush had settled into its comfortable rhythm. The soft hiss of bacon on the griddle mingled with the gentle clink of silverware against ceramic plates, while the aroma of fresh coffee and homemade apple pie wrapped around the diners like a well-worn blanket. This was Eagle Rock's heart, a place where hunters stopped after long days in the wilderness, where travelers found respite on mountain highways, and where locals gathered to share the quiet communion of good food and familiar faces. In the far corner booth, almost hidden in the shadows cast by a mounted elk head, Steven Seagal sat with the stillness of deep water. At 64, he carried his years like a weathered oak carries rings, each one adding depth, not diminishing strength. His hands, scarred from decades of training and conflict, wrapped gently around a simple ceramic mug of green tea. He wore no indicators of his legendary status, no designer clothing or flashy accessories, just dark jeans, a simple black sweater, and the kind of quiet presence that made people glance his way without quite knowing why. Steven had chosen this table deliberately, positioned to observe the entire diner while remaining largely unnoticed. Old habits died hard, and decades of reading rooms, assessing threats, and protecting others had left him with an awareness that never quite switched off. But here, in this mountain sanctuary, he allowed himself something approaching peace. Locals knew who he was. His face had graced enough movie screens and magazine covers over the years, but they maintained an unspoken agreement to let him exist without the weight of recognition. Across the room, Eli Morgan occupied his customary window seat, a worn paperback novel open beside his plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. At 78, the retired Navy corpsman moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had begun to betray him, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. The Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his flannel shirt caught the light when he shifted, though he never drew attention to it. Like Steven, Eli understood the weight of service, the burden of memories, and the value of quiet spaces where a man could simply be. Jules Hernandez weaved between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been serving coffee since she was 16. Now 21 and working her way through community college, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of youth tempered by responsibility. In her apron pocket, alongside order pads and pens, she kept a small digital camera, always ready to capture moments for the documentary project that would hopefully earn her a scholarship to film school. Today she'd been recording the golden hour light streaming through the diner's windows, the way it transformed ordinary faces into something almost sacred. Kara Wolfe emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, flour dusting her apron from the evening's baking. She'd built this place with her own hands after her husband died, transforming a failing truck stop into the heart of the community. Her presence commanded respect without demanding it. the kind of woman who kept a baseball bat under the counter, but was more likely to solve problems with a slice of pie and a listening ear. The dinner crowd represented Eagle Rock in miniature. Miles Jensen, the local mechanic, sat at the counter discussing carburetor problems with Big Tom, a long-haul trucker whose rig waited outside like a sleeping giant. In a corner booth, the Morrison family celebrated their daughter's acceptance to Colorado State, their laughter adding warmth to the already cozy atmosphere. At another table, two hunters compared stories over plates of Kara's famous elk chili, their voices low and respectful in the way of men who understood the sacred relationship between predator and prey. Stephen observed it all through peripheral vision, finding comfort in the routine rhythms of ordinary life. This was America at its best, people taking care of each other, finding joy in simple pleasures, building community one conversation at a time. It reminded him why he'd spent so many years fighting to protect places like this, why the work mattered even when the cost seemed too high to bear. Jules finished photographing the way late sunlight transformed Eli's weathered hands as he turned a page, then moved to refresh coffee cups and check on the hunter's meal. She paused briefly at Stephen's table, offering a refill with the kind of respectful distance that said she knew exactly who he was, but understood his need for anonymity. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. As she walked away, Stephen noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere that preceded trouble like the pressure drop before a storm. Through the window, he watched a black Dodge Charger pull into the parking lot with unnecessary speed, gravel spinning under its tires as it slammed to a stop across two parking spaces. The music thumping from inside was audible even through the diner's walls, bass notes that seemed designed to announce the arrival of someone who needed the world to notice them. The engine cut off, but the silence that followed felt loaded with potential energy. Stephen's posture didn't change. He remained the picture of relaxed awareness, but something deep in his core shifted into readiness. He'd learned long ago to trust these moments of prescience, the way danger announced itself to those who knew how to listen. Inside the diner, conversations continued unabated. Eli turned another page of his novel. Kara wiped down tables. Jules refilled coffee cups, but Stephen waited, watching, as the car door slammed and footsteps approached the diner's entrance with the heavy tread of someone looking for a stage on which to perform. The bell above the door would ring soon, and with it, the peaceful evening would shatter like glass hitting concrete. But for now, in these last moments of tranquility, Stephen Seagal sat perfectly still and prepared for whatever was about to walk through that door. The bell above the door didn't so much ring as shriek, jarred by the force of Logan Trent's entrance. He didn't walk into Wolfe's Lodge diner. He invaded it, pushing through the door with the kind of deliberate aggression that announced his presence to every corner of the room. At 26, Logan carried himself with the coiled energy of a man perpetually ready for a fight. His lean frame draped in carefully distressed designer jeans and a leather jacket that probably cost more than most people in the diner made in a month. His entrance was theater, pure and simple. The way he let the door slam behind him, the exaggerated survey of the room with barely concealed contempt, the deliberate jangle of keys in his hand, all of it calculated to demand attention. His dark hair was styled in that particular way, that suggested hours of careful dishevelment, and the elaborate tattoo creeping up his neck spoke of someone who'd made himself into walking rebellion. "Yeah, I'll call you back," he said into his phone, voice pitched to carry across the entire diner. "Just stopped at some backwoods dump for food." He ended the call with theatrical disgust and shoved the phone into his jacket pocket, his eyes already scanning the room for his next source of entertainment. The effect was immediate and uncomfortable. Conversations didn't stop so much as they stumbled, losing their natural rhythm as diners found themselves drawn into unwilling awareness of the newcomer. Miles Jensen's discussion of carburetor problems faltered mid-sentence. Big Tom's laugh died in his throat. Even the Morrison family celebration quieted, parents instinctively moving closer to their children. Jules approached with professional neutrality, her order pad ready and her expression carefully neutral. She'd dealt with enough difficult customers to recognize the type, the kind who mistook rudeness for strength, who fed off the discomfort of others like emotional parasites. "Welcome to Wolfe's Lodge," she said evenly. "Can I get you something to drink?" Logan's eyes flicked over her with the kind of assessment that made women reach for pepper spray. His gaze lingered deliberately, invasively, before dismissing her with casual cruelty. "Coffee, black, and make it quick, and some of us have lives to get back to." Jules simply nodded and moved toward the coffee station, but Stephen noticed the subtle way she positioned herself to keep Logan in sight, the practiced movement of someone who'd learned to be cautious. Smart girl. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket and, with movements so smooth they appeared casual, opened the camera app and placed it on the counter facing the dining room. Not recording yet, but ready. Logan swiveled on his stool to take in the diner again, his survey more thorough this time. His attention moved from table to table like a predator evaluating potential prey, looking for weakness, for vulnerability, for someone who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. His gaze lingered on the elderly couples, the single diners, anyone who might provide him with the power dynamic he craved. "Place smells like a nursing home," he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying that particular brand of practiced cruelty that suggested he'd honed this act over years. "What is this, bingo night at the VFW?" The insult hung in the air like smoke from a struck match. Several diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kara emerged from the kitchen, her maternal instincts triggered by the obvious tension, but Logan's attention had already moved on, scanning, searching, until it landed on Eli Morgan. The elderly veteran sat quietly at his window table, his novel, closed now, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug with the slight tremor that betrayed his age. The Distinguished Service Cross on his chest caught the light, a small silver reminder of service and sacrifice that most people treated with the respect it deserved. But Logan wasn't most people. Something ugly flickered across Logan's face. Not just contempt, but the particular brand of resentment that some young men harbor toward their elders. Perhaps it was the visible symbols of accomplishment, the quiet dignity, or simply the fact that Eli represented everything Logan felt he'd been denied. Whatever the source, it transformed his features into something predatory. "Hey, Grandpa," Logan called out, his voice cutting through the diner's atmosphere like a blade. "What war was that? The Civil War?" He laughed at his own joke, loud and performative, the sound echoing off the wood-paneled walls like a gunshot. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every conversation in the diner died. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Coffee cups paused at lips. Even the sizzle from the kitchen seemed to quiet, as if the entire building held its breath. Eli didn't respond. He simply continued to sit with quiet dignity, his eyes steady, his expression unchanged except for the slightest tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd heard variations of this cruelty before. His silence was not weakness. It was the discipline of a man who'd learned to choose his battles wisely. But Logan interpreted restraint as invitation. "Probably can't hear me," he continued, louder now, feeding off the uncomfortable energy he'd created. "Hey, old-timer, I'm talking to you." Steven Seagal remained motionless in his corner booth, but something fundamental shifted in his posture. To the casual observer, he appeared unchanged, still relaxed, still focused on his tea. But decades of training had taught him to read the geometry of violence, to recognize the moments when cruelty tipped toward something more dangerous. This was one of those moments. Miles Jensen started to rise from his stool at the counter, his mechanic's hands clenching into fists, but Stephen caught his eye with the slightest shake of his head. Not yet. Not until they understood exactly what they were dealing with. Kara stepped forward, her maternal authority wrapped around her like armor. "Son," she said firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. This is a family establishment." Logan turned toward her with mock surprise, his eyebrows raised, in theatrical innocence. "Lower my voice, lady? I'm just trying to have a conversation with the local war hero over there. Ain't that right, Pops?" The cruelty in his voice was palpable now, no longer hidden behind false joviality. This wasn't casual rudeness. This was deliberate humiliation, performed for an audience. Logan had found his victim and his stage, and he was just getting started. Jules's finger hovered over the record button on her phone. Big Tom's massive frame tensed like a coiled spring. The Morrison family's children pressed closer to their parents, sensing danger they couldn't quite understand. And in his corner booth, Steven Seagal set down his teacup with the care of a man who knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this ended with words or with something much worse. The crack in the glass had appeared. Now they would see if it would spread, or if someone would step forward to prevent the shattering that threatened to destroy the peace they'd all taken for granted. Logan Trent had no idea he was about to meet his match. Not in violence, but in something far more dangerous. The quiet strength of a man who'd learned that true power came not from causing fear, but from refusing to let it take root. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, suspended in the amber light of the diner like an insect trapped in resin. Logan Trent stood poised between tables, feeding off the discomfort radiating from every corner of Wolfe's lodge like a vampire drawing sustenance from fear. His eyes remained fixed on Eli Morgan with the single-minded focus of a predator who'd identified the weakest member of the herd. Eli's silence only seemed to inflame Logan's need for dominance. In his twisted logic, the elderly veteran's dignity wasn't strength. It was weakness masquerading as nobility, and Logan had built his identity around exposing such pretenses. He'd learned young that the world was divided into those who took and those who got taken from, and every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea that this frail old man deserved respect he himself had never received. "You know what I think?" Logan said, his voice dropping to a mockingly conversational tone that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. He began to move toward Eli's table with the lazy confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his cruelty. "I think all you old-timers are living off stories from 50 years ago. Vietnam, Korea, World War II. Ancient history, Pops. What have you done lately?" The words hit the diner like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of shock and disgust through the gathered diners. Miles Jensen's face darkened with anger. The Morrison family's father instinctively moved his children behind him. Even Big Tom, who'd seen his share of roadhouse fights, looked genuinely appalled. But Eli remained still, his weathered hands steady around his coffee mug, his eyes fixed on some point beyond Logan's shoulder. The metal on his chest rose and fell with his controlled breathing, catching the light like a small beacon of defiance against the darkness Logan brought with him. "Matter of fact," Logan continued, now standing directly beside Eli's table, "I bet half you old guys bought those medals at a pawn shop. Stolen valor, right? That's what they call it when wannabes like you pretend to be heroes." The accusation struck the diner like a physical blow. Several patrons gasped audibly. Jules's hand tightened on her phone, her finger poised over the record button, torn between documentation and intervention. This had crossed from harassment into something approaching sacred desecration. That's when Logan made his move. With the casual cruelty of someone who'd perfected the art of humiliation, he reached across the table and grabbed Eli's worn leather wallet from beside his coffee cup. The old man's hand moved to stop him, but arthritis and age made him too slow. Logan's young reflexes easily evaded the gentle attempt at resistance. "Let's see what kind of hero you really are, Grandpa," Logan said, flipping open the wallet with theatrical flair. Bills, perhaps $40 in worn 20s and 10s, spilled onto the table. But Logan's attention focused on something else, a small, carefully folded photograph tucked behind the veteran's driver's license. Steven Seagal's teacup paused halfway to his lips as he watched Logan unfold the photograph. Even from across the room, he could see what it was. The kind of faded military unit photo that veterans carried like talismans. Images of young men who'd shared impossible circumstances and forged bonds that transcended ordinary friendship. The kind of photo that represented not just memory, but sacred trust. "Well, well," Logan said, holding the photograph up to the light. The image showed 6 young men in military fatigues, their arms around each other's shoulders, their faces carrying the particular expression of soldiers who'd seen too much but still believed in something worth fighting for. At the center, unmistakably recognizable despite 5 decades of aging, stood a young Eli Morgan. For the first time since Logan's arrival, Eli spoke. "Please," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of loss and longing. "That's all I have left of them." The words should have stopped any decent person. The obvious pain in the old man's voice, the tremor of genuine anguish, it should have penetrated even the thickest armor of cruelty. But Logan Trent had spent years building walls against empathy, and Eli's vulnerability only seemed to excite him further. "All you have left?" Logan's grin turned savage. "Guess they didn't make it home, huh? Too bad, Pops. Maybe if you'd been a better soldier?" The photograph tore with a sound like breaking glass. Logan ripped it cleanly in half, then quarters, the pieces of Eli's irreplaceable memory fluttering to the floor like dying leaves. The sound of destruction echoed through the suddenly silent diner with the finality of a coffin lid closing. The effect was immediate and devastating. Eli's face crumpled, not with anger but with a grief so profound it seemed to age him years in seconds. His hands, still reaching toward the torn pieces, trembled with more than arthritis now. A soft sound escaped his throat. Not quite a moan, not quite a sob, but the sound of a man watching his most precious possession destroyed for no reason other than another man's need to cause pain. Kara Wolfe rushed forward, her maternal instincts overriding caution. "Stop it!" she shouted, reaching for Logan's arm. "What's wrong with you?" Logan shoved her aside with casual violence, sending the 50-something woman stumbling backward, into an empty chair. The physical assault shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. This was no longer just harassment. It was criminal behavior unfolding in front of a room full of witnesses. "Stay out of this, lady," Logan snarled, pocketing Eli's cash with one hand while reaching for the Distinguished Service Cross with the other. Maybe Grandpa here will learn not to wear medals he didn't earn. His fingers closed around the silver cross, and he yanked it from Eli's shirt with enough force to tear the fabric. The medal, awarded for extraordinary heroism under fire, for saving the lives of wounded comrades while under heavy enemy fire, disappeared into Logan's jacket pocket like stolen candy. The room erupted in barely contained outrage. Big Tom surged to his feet, his massive frame casting shadows across the room. Miles Jensen's stool scraped against the floor as he stood. The Morrison family's father positioned himself between his children and the confrontation, his face pale with protective fury. But it was the sound that stopped them all, the soft, deliberate scrape of a teacup being placed on a wooden table. In his corner booth, Seagal had finally moved. The motion was so subtle that some patrons missed it entirely. He didn't leap to his feet or shout threats or make any of the dramatic gestures that lesser men might have chosen. He simply set down his tea with the care of someone who understood that the next few seconds would determine whether this ended with healing or with devastation. Then he stood. The movement was liquid, economical, carrying none of the creaking protests that might be expected from a man his age. One moment he was seated, the next he was upright, his presence suddenly filling the corner of the diner like water filling a container. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't do anything that could be called threatening. But somehow the entire geometry of the room shifted around him. Logan, still riding high on his performance of cruelty, turned toward this new presence with the lazy confidence of someone who'd never met anything he couldn't handle through intimidation and violence. His eyes swept over Stephen dismissively. Just another old man, probably another veteran, certainly another sheep ready for shearing. "You got a problem, Pops?" Logan asked, his voice carrying the same mocking tone he'd used on Eli. "Want to tell me some war stories, too?" Steven Seagal looked at him with eyes that had seen real combat, real violence, real consequences. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Son," he said, simply, "you're going to want to return what you took." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down at dawn. Logan's sneer faltered slightly as something in Stephen's tone penetrated his armor of arrogance. This wasn't the frightened resistance of an old man defending his dignity. This was something else entirely. This was the voice of someone who'd faced down actual monsters and won. But Logan Trent had built his entire identity around never backing down, never showing weakness, never letting anyone see the scared child hiding beneath his carefully constructed armor of aggression. To surrender now in front of all these witnesses would be to admit that everything he'd told himself about strength and power had been a lie. So instead of wisdom, he chose escalation. "Or what, old man?" he said, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket in a gesture that was equal parts threat and theater. "You gonna make me?" The question hung in the golden light of the diner like smoke from a loaded gun. Around the room, decent people held their breath and waited to see if the evening would end with redemption or with violence that would scar them all forever. But Steven Seagal had faced this choice countless times before, and he'd learned something that Logan Trent was about to discover. Sometimes the most powerful response to a threat wasn't force. Sometimes it was the complete absence of fear. Steven. Seagal took a single step forward, and the entire universe of Wolfe's Lodge Diner seemed to contract around that movement. It wasn't the aggressive advance of someone spoiling for a fight. It was the measured approach of someone who understood exactly what he was dealing with and had already calculated 17 different ways to end it. The step carried with it the weight of decades spent in places where hesitation meant death, where reading an opponent's intentions could mean the difference between going home or being carried out. Logan Trent felt the shift immediately, though he couldn't have articulated why. Something in his primitive brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats ruled the world, began screaming warnings. This wasn't like the other old men he'd terrorized over the years. Those had been sheep disguised as wolves, men whose bark was worse than their bite, who folded the moment he showed them the reality of modern violence. This was different. This was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and Logan had just pulled on its tail. "You want to know what I'm going to do?" Steven asked, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather. He took another step, closing the distance between them with mathematical precision. "First, I'm going to explain something to you about respect. Then you're going to return that medal and that money. Then you're going to apologize to Mr. Morgan and Mrs. Wolfe. And then you're going to walk out of here with a lesson you'll remember for the rest of your life." The words should have sounded like empty threats, the kind of tough talk that preceded either violence or humiliation when the talker realized he'd bitten off more than he could chew. But something in Steven's delivery made them sound like prophecy, like statements of fact delivered with the certainty of someone reading from a script he'd already seen play out. Logan's hand tightened on whatever he carried in his jacket pocket. Knife, brass knuckles, perhaps even a gun. The gesture was meant to be intimidating, a reminder that he came prepared for escalation. But Steven's eyes tracked the movement, with the casual interest of someone noting the weather, and his expression didn't change at all. "See, here's what you don't understand," Steven continued, still moving forward with that same measured pace. "You think strength is about making people afraid of you. But real strength, the kind that man over there earned in a jungle on the other side of the world, real strength is about making people feel safe, about standing between the innocent and the darkness, not becoming the darkness yourself." The words hit Logan like physical blows, not because they were harsh, but because they exposed the fundamental emptiness at the core of everything he'd built his identity around. His whole life had been constructed on the premise that power came from fear, that respect was just another word for intimidation successfully applied. But this man was suggesting something else entirely, that everything Logan believed about strength was not just wrong, but backwards. "You don't know anything about me," Logan snarled, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. The hand in his pocket shifted, and several patrons tensed, ready to dive for cover if weapons appeared. Steven noticed the movement, cataloged it, dismissed it as a threat. "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you grew up feeling powerless. I know someone made you feel small, probably when you were too young to defend yourself. I know you learned that the world is divided into predators and prey, and you decided you'd rather be the predator." Each word landed with surgical precision, cutting through layers of bluster and bravado to expose the raw wound beneath. Logan's face went pale, then flushed red with a rage that was part fury, part recognition of truth he'd never spoken aloud. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Shut up," he whispered, then louder, "Shut up. I know you tell yourself that makes you strong," Stephen continued, relentless but not cruel. "But look around this room. Look at their faces. You see fear and you think that's respect. But what you're really seeing is pity. They're not afraid of you. They're afraid for you." Logan's world was tilting on its axis. Everything he'd understood about power dynamics, about social hierarchies, about his place in the world, was being systematically dismantled by a man who spoke in the same tone others might use to explain how to change a tire. Worse, he could feel the truth of it in his bones, could see it reflected in the faces of the diners around him. They weren't cowering in terror. They were looking at him with something far more devastating: compassion for someone who'd lost his way so completely that he thought cruelty was strength. "You want to know what real courage looks like?" Stephen gestured toward Eli Morgan, who sat quietly watching the confrontation with steady eyes. "That man saved 6 lives under enemy fire. Got shot twice doing it, kept going anyway. You know why? Not because he wasn't afraid, because he was terrified. But he did it anyway because someone had to stand between his friends and the bullets." Logan's gaze flicked toward Eli involuntarily, and for the first time, he saw not a weak-old man to be exploited, but a young soldier who'd faced death and chosen duty over self-preservation. The metal he'd stolen suddenly felt heavy in his pocket, like it was burning through the fabric. "He never talks about it," Stephen continued. "Never. Brags, never demands special treatment. Just shows up day after day, trying to make the world a little better than he found it. That's what heroes look like in real life. Not the loud ones demanding attention, but the quiet ones doing the work." The room had gone completely silent, except for the soft hiss of something cooking in the kitchen and the distant whisper of wind through the aspens outside. Every person in the diner was frozen, watching this strange confrontation between two kinds of strength, one loud and desperate, the other quiet and certain. "Now," Stephen said, stopping just outside Logan's personal space, close enough to touch but careful not to make it physical, "I'm going to give you a choice. You can keep playing this game, keep pretending that fear equals respect, keep walking through the world trying to make yourself feel bigger by making others feel smaller, or you can do something that actually takes courage." Logan's breathing had become shallow, rapid. The predatory confidence that had carried him into the diner was evaporating like mist in sunlight, leaving behind only the frightened, angry child he'd been trying to outrun his entire adult life. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, and his voice was smaller now, uncertain. Stephen's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "It means you can choose to be the kind of man who protects people instead of preying on them. It means you can give that medal back and apologize. Not because I'm making you, but because it's the right thing to do. It means you can walk out of here having learned something instead of having lost something." The choice hung in the air between them like a bridge over a chasm. Logan could feel the weight of every eye in the room, could sense the collective held breath of people waiting to see which version of himself he would choose to be. The hand in his pocket loosened its grip on whatever weapon he'd been prepared to draw. For the first time in years, Logan Trent found himself face to face with an opponent he couldn't intimidate, couldn't outshout, couldn't reduce to fear or submission, and in that moment of recognition, he glimpsed something he'd never allowed himself to believe possible. That strength might not be about making others smaller, but about becoming something larger than the sum of his own pain and anger. The question was whether he had the courage to reach for it. In the golden light of Wolfe's Lodge diner, surrounded by the quiet judgment of decent people, Logan Trent stood at a crossroads that would define not just this moment, but the trajectory of the rest of his life. Behind him lay the familiar comfort of rage and the hollow satisfaction of dominance through fear. Ahead lay something more difficult and more terrifying than any violence he could imagine, the possibility of becoming someone worthy of genuine respect. Steven Seagal waited patiently, his presence a constant reminder that some battles were won not through force, but through the simple refusal to be anything less than what the moment demanded. Around them, the diner held its breath and waited to see which way the story would turn. The moment stretched like heated metal, malleable and dangerous, ready to either bend into something new or snap with devastating finality. Logan Trent stood frozen in the amber light of Wolfe's Lodge diner, his hand still poised over the weapon in his jacket pocket, his entire world view cracking like ice under spring sun. Around him, the assembled diners held their collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something that would either end in violence or transformation, and unsure which would be more unsettling. Steven Seagal remained perfectly still, his presence filling the space between them like a force field. He didn't advance or retreat, didn't gesture or threaten. He simply existed with the kind of complete awareness that made lesser men feel transparent, as if their intentions were written in languages he'd learned to read decades ago. His eyes never left Logan's face, but somehow he seemed to be tracking every micro-movement, every shift in breathing, every tell that might indicate which way the young man's desperation would tip him. Logan's breathing had become audible now, sharp and shallow like a cornered animal's. The predatory confidence that had carried him into the diner was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. The unpredictability of someone whose entire sense of self was disintegrating in real time. He'd built his identity on being the most dangerous person in any room, the one who made others afraid. But here stood a man who radiated the kind of calm that only came from having faced real monsters and survived, not through luck or brutality, but through something Logan was only beginning to understand. "You think you know me?" Logan said, his voice cracking slightly on the words. The hand in his pocket shifted, and the subtle sound of metal against fabric made several patrons tense. "You think you can just psychoanalyze me and I'll fold like some punk kid?" Steven's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he'd cataloged the sound, identified the weapon, and calculated his response. "I think you're scared," he said simply. "I think you've been scared for so long that anger feels safer than vulnerability. I think you learned early that the world was a cruel place, and you decided to become cruel right back." Each word landed, like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through Logan's carefully constructed defenses. He could feel the truth of it in his bones, could remember the foster homes where strength meant survival, the juvenile detention centers where showing weakness invited predation, the long succession of temporary guardians who'd taught him that. Trust was just another word for victimhood waiting to happen. "Shut up," he whispered. Then louder, "Shut the hell up." His hand closed around the knife handle in his pocket, and he pulled it halfway free before stopping, caught between the impulse to strike and some deeper recognition that violence wouldn't solve what was breaking inside him. The blade caught the diner's golden light, just visible enough to confirm what everyone had suspected. But instead of panic, instead of screams or diving for cover, the room seemed to settle into an even deeper stillness. It was as if the revelation of the weapon had somehow made the situation clearer, rather than more dangerous. Miles Jensen's hand moved slowly toward the wrench he kept in his belt, but he didn't draw it. Big Tom shifted his considerable bulk, slightly, positioning himself to protect the other diners, but made no aggressive moves. Even Jules, still recording on her phone, didn't flinch or run. They all seemed to understand instinctively that this moment belonged to Steven Seagal and Logan Trent, that any interference might shatter whatever delicate process was unfolding between them. "There are 12 ways this ends," Steven said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You don't want any of them." The words hung in the air like a mathematical equation, precise and undeniable. Logan's eyes darted around the room, suddenly seeing not victims but witnesses, not sheep but people who would remember every detail of what happened next. For the first time, he began to understand that his actions had consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment, that the story of what happened here would follow him long after the adrenaline faded. "You're bluffing," Logan said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Nothing about Steven Seagal suggested bluff or bravado, He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone stating facts, like a doctor explaining a diagnosis or a meteorologist predicting rain. That's when Eli Morgan finally spoke. "Son," the elderly veteran said, his voice carrying across the silent diner with surprising strength. "There are two kinds of men in this world." He paused, his weathered hands steady now as he looked directly at Logan for the first time since the confrontation began. "Those who've been broken by their pain and those who've been strengthened by it." Logan's head snapped toward Eli, the knife still partially visible in his trembling hand. "What the hell would you know about pain, old man? You got your medals, your respect, your place in history. What did I get? What did any of us get?" Eli's eyes filled with something that wasn't pity but wasn't quite compassion either. Something deeper, more complex. "I got nightmares that still wake me up 50 years later," he said quietly. "I got the faces of friends who didn't make it home burned into my memory. I got arthritis in my hands from carrying wounded men through rice paddies, and a heart condition from breathing Agent Orange. I got a government that forgot about us the moment the cameras stopped rolling, and a country that blamed us for a war we didn't start." Logan's grip on the knife loosened slightly. This wasn't the triumphant war story he'd expected, the self-congratulatory narrative that would justify his resentment. "But you know what else I got?" Eli continued, his voice gaining strength. "I got the knowledge that I stood up when it mattered, that when people needed someone to step between them and the darkness, I stepped. Not because I was brave, God knows I was terrified every single day, but because someone had to do it." He gestured toward the torn pieces of his photograph scattered on the floor. "Those boys in that picture, they were scared too. Jimmy Kowalski from Detroit, barely 19. Danny Chen from San Francisco, wanted to be a teacher. Marcus Williams, from Alabama, had a baby girl he'd never seen. They all had reasons to run, to hide, to let someone else take the risks." Logan found himself leaning forward despite himself, drawn into the story despite his anger. "But they didn't run," Eli said simply. "And when the shooting started, when everything went to hell, they stood their ground. Not for glory, not for medals, not even for country. They stood their ground for each other. Because that's what you do when you're part of something bigger than yourself." The knife slipped from Logan's nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed diner. He stared at Eli with something approaching wonder, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "I don't know how to be that," Logan whispered, his voice so quiet it was barely audible. "I don't know how to be anything but angry." Steven Seagal took a step closer, close enough now that Logan could have reached out and touched him. But there was nothing threatening in the movement. It was the approach of someone offering shelter from a storm. "Anger's not the problem," Steven said gently. "Anger can be righteous, can be fuel for justice. The problem is what you're doing with it. You're using it to tear down instead of build up, to hurt instead of heal. But that's a choice, son. Every single day, that's a choice." Logan looked around the diner, at Kara Wolfe, who was watching him with cautious hope instead of fear, at Miles Jensen, whose hand had moved away from his wrench, at Jules, still recording, but with tears in her eyes, at the other patrons who were looking at him not with hatred, but with something that might have been recognition of their own struggles. For the first time in his adult life, Logan Trent found himself in a room full of people who weren't afraid of him. And instead of feeling diminished by their lack of fear, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the possibility that he might be worthy of something better than terror. The knife lay forgotten on the diner floor, its threat neutralized not by force but by the simple recognition that some battles could only be won by refusing to fight them. Logan stood at the crossroads of his own story, finally understanding that the next choice he made would determine not just this moment, but every moment that followed. Behind him lay a lifetime of choosing anger over understanding, dominance over connection, fear over hope. Ahead lay something terrifying and wonderful, the possibility of becoming someone he could actually respect. The silence that followed. Logan's whispered admission stretched through Wolfe's Lodge diner like morning mist, delicate and transformative. The knife lay on the worn wooden floor between the tables, no longer a weapon, but somehow transformed into evidence of a different kind of victory, the kind that left everyone changed but no one wounded. Logan Trent stood amid the scattered pieces of Eli Morgan's photograph, his anger finally exhausted, leaving behind only the frightened young man he'd been trying so hard to outrun. Seagal remained motionless, understanding instinctively that this moment required space rather than action. He'd seen enough transformations to know they were fragile things, easily shattered by the wrong word or gesture. Around the room, the other diners maintained their vigil, witnesses to something none of them had expected when they'd sat down for an ordinary evening meal. Logan's hands trembled as he looked down at the torn pieces of the photograph. 5 decades of memory reduced to fragments on a restaurant floor. The casual cruelty of what he'd done struck him with full force, now that his rage had burned out, leaving him to confront the reality of his actions without the insulating armor of righteous anger. He began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat like smoke. He'd spent so many years using language as a weapon that he'd forgotten how to make it a bridge. I don't know how to fix this. Eli Morgan studied him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to waste time on judgment. The elderly veteran's face bore no trace of triumph or vindication, only a kind of weary wisdom that came from understanding how easily pain could twist people into shapes they never intended to become. Come here, son, Eli said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that had nothing to do with rank or age and everything to do with simple human decency. Logan hesitated, caught between the impulse to flee and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. The old man's tone held. No threat, no mockery, no trace of the humiliation Logan expected and probably deserved. It was instead an invitation. The first genuine offer of grace he'd received in longer than he could remember. Slowly, as if approaching something sacred that might vanish if he moved too quickly, Logan walked to Eli's table. The other diners watched in fascination as the young man who'd strutted into their midst like a conquering warlord now moved with the hesitant steps of someone learning to walk on unfamiliar ground. Sit down, Eli said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Help me put it back together. The request was so unexpected, so contrary to every script Logan had written about conflict and consequence, that he simply stared for a moment. In his experience, victories were absolute things. Someone won, someone lost, someone dominated, someone submitted. The idea that reconstruction could follow destruction, that healing could emerge from harm, was as foreign to him as speaking, in tongues. But Eli was already reaching for the scattered pieces of the photograph, his arthritic fingers moving carefully among the fragments. This one's Jimmy Kowalski, he said, holding up a torn corner that showed part of a young face beneath a military cup. Detroit boy. Used to tell jokes that weren't funny, but we laughed anyway because his timing was perfect. Logan found himself sinking into the chair despite every instinct screaming at him to run. He watched in fascination as Eli continued, gathering pieces, treating each fragment with the reverence of an archaeologist reassembling pottery from a sacred site. This is Danny Chen, Eli continued, indicating another piece. Smartest guy in our unit. Could have been anything. Doctor, lawyer, professor. Chose to serve instead. Used to write letters to his little sister every single day. Almost without conscious decision, Logan found himself reaching for a piece of the photograph that had fallen near his feet. The fragment showed part of a young soldier's hand, fingers intertwined with those of the man beside him, a gesture of brotherhood that transcended the formal military pose. That's Marcus Williams, Eli said when he saw what Logan held. Alabama. Had hands like yours. Young. Strong. Used those hands to carry wounded men to safety when the helicopters couldn't land. Lost 3 fingers to shrapnel doing it, but never stopped trying to help. Logan stared at the fragment in his palm, seeing not just a piece of old photograph but a window into a world where strength meant sacrifice, where courage meant choosing to act despite fear, where young men like himself had faced impossible choices and chosen to be better than their circumstances. Why are you telling me this? Logan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli looked up from his careful reconstruction work, his eyes meeting Logan's with startling directness. Because those boys were scared too, he said simply. Every single one of them came from somewhere that hurt. Jimmy's father drank. Danny's family lost everything in the Depression. Marcus grew up with nothing but hope and determination. He paused in his work, holding a piece of the photograph up to the light as if testing its fit with another fragment. They could have let that pain make them cruel, could have decided the world owed them something, could have taken their anger out on anyone weaker than themselves. Instead, they chose to be protectors. Logan felt something shifting inside him like tectonic plates finding new positions after an earthquake. How do you choose that? He asked. How do you choose to be better? Same way you choose anything else, Eli replied, pressing two pieces of the photograph together with infinite care. One decision at a time. One moment at a time. You decide that the pain stops with you, that you're going to be the one who breaks the cycle instead of continuing it. Jules Hernandez had moved closer during their conversation, her phone still, recording but now with the reverence of someone documenting something sacred rather than sensational. She could see the story unfolding in front of her. Not the viral video of violence she'd feared she might capture, but something far more powerful. The real-time transformation of a human soul. Other diners had begun to relax slightly, sensing that the immediate danger had passed. But they remained transfixed by the scene at Eli's table, watching as the old veteran and the young aggressor worked together to rebuild what had been broken. It was a masterclass in forgiveness, in the kind of grace that most people talked about but rarely had the courage to practice. My hands are shaking, Logan said, frustrated as he tried to align two pieces of the photograph. The fine motor control required for the delicate work was beyond him in his current emotional state. Mine too, Eli admitted with a slight smile. Arthritis. Been getting worse every year. But we'll manage together. Together. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Logan couldn't remember the last time anyone had suggested working with him rather than against him, couldn't recall when someone had offered partnership instead of domination or submission. Steven Seagal watched from his position near Logan's abandoned knife, understanding that his role in this drama was essentially complete. He'd provided the catalyst, the external pressure necessary to crack Logan's defensive shell. But the real work, the slow, patient reconstruction of a human heart, that was happening between the old soldier and the young man who'd tried to destroy him. Wolfe approached their table carrying a small roll of clear tape, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood the sacred nature of what was transpiring. She set it down without a word, then retreated to give them space to continue their work. Why? Logan asked suddenly, his hands stilling over the photograph pieces. Why help me? Why not just call the cops, press charges, make me pay? Eli was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because someone helped me once, he said finally. After I came home from Vietnam, I was angry, lost, drinking too much, picking fights with anyone who looked at me wrong. A stranger, older guy, Korean war vet, took the time to show me there was another way. He pressed another piece of the photograph into place, the image slowly taking shape like a Polaroid developing. Never learned his name. He helped me for one afternoon, then disappeared. But that one act of grace changed the trajectory of my entire life. Logan stared at the partially reconstructed photograph, seeing not just the image of young soldiers, but a map of possibilities, a different way of being in the world. What if I can't change? He whispered. What if this is just who I am? Eli reached across the table and placed one weathered hand over Logan's trembling one. Son, he said gently, the fact that you're asking that question means you've already started. In the golden light of Wolfe's Lodge diner, surrounded by witnesses to grace and transformation, two men from different generations worked together to rebuild what had been broken. And in that simple act of reconstruction, something far more important than a photograph was being repaired. The faith that redemption was possible, that people could change, that the cycles of pain and cruelty that seemed so permanent could, be broken by the simple decision to choose healing over harm. The pieces of the photograph were coming together, imperfect but whole, held together by tape and hope and the radical act of forgiveness. It would never be the same as it was before. The cracks would always be visible, the damage a permanent part of its story. But perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps the most beautiful things were the ones that had been broken and lovingly repaired, their scars not hidden but transformed into proof of resilience, evidence that even the most shattered things could be made whole again. The autumn sun had begun its descent behind the Colorado peaks by the time Logan Trent finished taping the last piece of Eli Morgan's photograph back together. What had once been a pristine image of 6 young soldiers was now a patchwork of memories, held together by transparent tape and something far more powerful. The recognition that broken things could be made whole, that destruction didn't have to be permanent, that even the most thoughtless acts of cruelty could be transformed into opportunities for grace. Logan sat back in his chair, staring at their handiwork with a mixture of pride and shame. The photograph would never be the same. The tape lines would always be visible, creating a spiderweb of scars across the faces of young men who'd given everything for their brothers in arms. But somehow the imperfection made it more beautiful, not less. It was a testament to resilience, proof that some things were worth saving no matter how badly they'd been damaged. "It's not perfect," Logan said quietly, his voice carrying none of the aggressive bravado that had characterized his speech an hour earlier. The young man who'd strutted into Wolfe's Lodge diner looking for victims to dominate was gone, replaced by someone who looked younger and older simultaneously. Younger in his vulnerability, older in his dawning understanding of what it meant to take responsibility for the harm he'd caused. Eli Morgan examined their work with the careful attention of someone who understood that the photograph's value had nothing to do with its aesthetic perfection and everything to do with what it represented. "Perfect things break easy," he said, running one arthritic finger along the edge of a tape line. "Things that have been broken and put back together, they're stronger. They know what they survived." Around them, the diner had begun to return to something approaching normal rhythm. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Forks resumed their journey to mouths. Coffee cups were refilled and emptied. But there was a different quality to the normalcy, a heightened awareness, as if everyone present understood they'd witnessed something significant, something that would stay with them long after they'd paid their checks and returned to their ordinary lives. Seagal had quietly returned to his corner booth, but his tea sat untouched as he watched the continuing interaction between Logan and Eli. Years of experience had taught him to recognize the fragile nature of transformation, the way people could backslide into old patterns if the new ones weren't given time to take root. This was the crucial moment, not the dramatic confrontation or the tearful breakthrough, but the quiet aftermath when good intentions would either crystallize into lasting change or dissolve under the weight of habit and circumstance. Jules Hernandez had stopped recording, understanding instinctively that some moments were too sacred for documentation. But she kept her phone close, sensing that the story wasn't over, that what happened next might be as important as what had already transpired. Logan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the worn wooden floor. For a moment, panic flickered across several faces. Was he fleeing? Was the spell broken? Had the temporary ceasefire dissolved back into hostility? But instead of heading for the door, Logan walked to where his knife lay forgotten on the floor, picked it up and carried it directly to Kara Wolfe behind the counter. "Ma'am," he said, his voice formal with the kind of respect he'd never learned to show before. "I want to apologize for threatening you, for putting everyone in danger. This doesn't belong in a place like this." He placed the knife on the counter and stepped back, his hands raised slightly to show they were empty. Kara studied him with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd spent decades reading people, assessing their sincerity, determining whether they posed a genuine threat or were simply lost souls looking for direction. She saw something in Logan's face that made her nod slowly, then reach under the counter and produce a small wooden box. "I've been collecting these for 30 years, she said, opening the box to reveal a collection of knives, brass knuckles, and other weapons. Amazing how many people come in here looking for trouble and leave it behind instead." Logan stared at the collection, understanding that he wasn't the first person to walk into this diner carrying anger and weapons, and he wouldn't be the last. But perhaps, like the others who'd contributed to Kara's collection, he could be someone who chose to walk away carrying something better. "There's something else," Logan said, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing Eli's Distinguished Service Cross. The medal caught the diner's golden light, its silver surface reflecting the faces of everyone who'd witnessed its theft and now its return. "This belongs to Mr. Morgan." He walked back to Eli's table, holding the medal with a reverence that would have been unimaginable an hour earlier. The weight of it in his palm felt enormous, not just the physical weight of silver and ribbon, but the emotional weight of sacrifice, of honor earned through blood and courage and the kind of selfless service Logan was only beginning to comprehend. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite control. "I want to give this back. And I want to. I need to ask you something." Eli looked up from the reconstructed photograph, his eyes patient and kind. "What's that, son?" "How do I start?" Logan asked. "How do I become the kind of person who deserves to be in the same room as someone like you?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with sincerity and the desperate hope of someone who'd caught a glimpse of a different way of being and was terrified it might slip away before he could grasp it fully. Eli was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words with care. "You start by starting," he said finally. "You wake up tomorrow and make one good choice. Then you wake up the day after that and make another one. You keep doing that until good choices become habit instead of exception." Logan nodded, understanding that transformation wasn't a single moment of dramatic change but a series of small decisions made consistently over time. "What kind of good choices?" "Help someone who can't help you back," Eli suggested. "Stand up for someone who's being picked on. Volunteer somewhere that needs extra hands. Find ways to build instead of tear down, to heal instead of harm." As if summoned by their conversation, Logan suddenly remembered something. "Wait here," he said, then caught himself. "I mean, if that's okay. I'll be right back." He hurried toward the exit, leaving the other diners to exchange puzzled glances. Through the windows, they could see him jogging toward his black Dodge Charger, the same car that had announced his threatening arrival with spinning tires and aggressive music. But when he returned 5 minutes later, he carried something in his hands that transformed the entire gesture, a small, inexpensive picture frame purchased from the convenience store down the road. "I know it's not much," Logan said, approaching Eli's table with the hesitant steps of someone offering a gift they weren't sure would be accepted. "But I thought maybe the picture deserved something better than just tape." The frame was simple, black plastic with a thin silver border, the kind of thing that might cost $5 at most. But the gesture it represented was worth more than gold. The recognition that some things were precious not because of their monetary value, but because of what they meant to the people who treasured them. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the frame, not from arthritis this time, but from emotion. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of benediction. Together, they carefully placed the reconstructed photograph into the frame. The tape lines were still visible, the scars of its destruction still apparent, but somehow the frame transformed it from a damaged relic into something that looked deliberately artistic, intentionally meaningful. It was no longer just a photograph that had been broken and repaired. It was a testament to the power of redemption, visual proof that beautiful things could emerge from acts of destruction if someone cared enough to do the work of healing. Jules couldn't help herself. She raised her phone and captured the moment when Eli held up the framed photograph, examining their work in the golden light of the dying day. But this time her documentation felt different, less like exploitation and more like witnessing, preserving a moment of grace that might otherwise be lost to time. Around the diner, other patrons had begun to smile, not the nervous smiles of people trying to diffuse tension, but genuine expressions of joy at witnessing something beautiful. The Morrison family's children pressed closer to see the photograph, their earlier fear replaced by curiosity about the young soldiers frozen in time. Big Tom wiped his eyes with the back of his massive hand, remembering his own father's war stories. Miles Jensen nodded approvingly, recognizing the kind of practical redemption that came through hands-on work. Logan stepped back from the table, his part in the reconstruction complete. But instead of the satisfaction he'd expected to feel, he found himself filled with something else entirely. The recognition that this was just the beginning, that the real work of transformation lay ahead of him, measured not in dramatic gestures, but in the accumulated weight of daily choices to be better than he'd been before. The frame sat on Eli's table like a small monument to the possibility of change, proof that even the most broken things could be made beautiful again if someone was willing to do the careful, patient work of putting the pieces back together. And in that simple act of reconstruction, everyone present had learned something about the true nature of strength, that it wasn't found in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to rebuild, to forgive, to believe that tomorrow could be different from today if someone was brave enough to make it so. 3 hours after Logan Trent walked out of Wolfe's Lodge diner carrying a lesson instead of leaving destruction in his wake, Jules Hernandez sat in her small apartment above the used bookstore on Main Street, staring at the footage she'd captured on her phone. The video was raw, unedited, a digital chronicle of transformation that had unfolded in real time before her eyes. But as she watched it back, she realized she held something more valuable than just documentation. She held a story that could change how people thought about conflict, about redemption, about the true nature of strength. The footage began with Logan's aggressive entrance, his theatrical cruelty, his systematic humiliation of Eli Morgan. But Jules found herself focusing less on the destruction and more on the faces of the other diners. The way they'd initially frozen in uncomfortable, paralysis, uncertain how to intervene, trapped between the desire to help and the fear of making things worse. It was a mirror of society itself, she realized, the way communities often stood by while bullies operated, not from cowardice, but from the genuine confusion about how to effectively oppose aggression without becoming aggressive themselves. Then came Steven Seagal's intervention, not with fists or fury, but with something far more powerful. The kind of moral authority that could only be earned through years of choosing principle over convenience, wisdom over retaliation. Jules watched the footage again, noting how Steven's presence had changed the entire dynamic of the room without a single violent act. His power lay not in his capacity for destruction, but in his absolute refusal to be intimidated. His ability to see through Logan's performance to the frightened child beneath. But the most compelling part of the video was what came after. The quiet reconstruction, the patient work of putting pieces back together, the moment when Logan chose healing over hatred. Jules had captured the exact instant when the young man's face changed, when anger gave way to understanding, when the possibility of redemption became visible in his eyes. She opened her laptop and began to edit, not to sensationalize or exploit, but to honor what she'd witnessed. The video she created wasn't about violence or confrontation, it was about transformation, about the courage required to choose growth over stagnation, forgiveness over revenge. She titled it simply, "Real Strength Looks Like This." As she worked, Jules thought about her own journey, her own struggles with anger and disappointment. She'd grown up in foster care herself, had felt the same powerless rage that had driven Logan to hurt others. But she'd been lucky. She'd found outlets in art and storytelling, mentors who'd shown her different ways to channel pain into purpose. Watching Logan's transformation, she realized how easily their positions could have been reversed, how thin the line was between victim and victimizer, between destruction and creation. The final video was 7 minutes long, a careful balance of context and revelation, showing enough of Logan's cruelty to establish the stakes but focusing primarily on the patient work of rebuilding that had followed. She included Eli's words about the two kinds of men, Steven's quiet authority, the moment when Logan chose to return the medal, and the final image of the two men working together to frame the reconstructed photograph. Jules uploaded the video to her social media accounts at 11:47 p.m., not expecting much beyond the usual likes from her film school classmates and local friends. She wrote a simple caption: "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to fight. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is help someone else become better than they were." Filmed tonight at Wolfe's Lodge Diner in Eagle Rock, Colorado. She fell asleep with her laptop still open, the video frozen on the image of Eli holding up the framed photograph, its tape-scarred surface somehow more beautiful for having been broken and lovingly repaired. By morning, everything had changed. Jules woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. The video had been shared 17 times overnight, then 53 times, then hundreds. Comments were pouring in. Not the usual internet toxicity she'd expected, but genuine responses from people who'd been moved by what they'd witnessed. "This made me cry at my desk at work. Thank you for showing us what real courage looks like. Shared this with my son who's been having trouble with bullies at school. He said it helped him understand there are different ways to be strong. My dad was a Vietnam vet. He would have loved seeing Mr. Morgan get the respect he deserved. Thank you for documenting this. I was a lot like Logan when I was younger. Seeing this gives me hope that it's never too late to change." The view count climbed steadily throughout the day. 500 views, then 2,000, then 10,000. Local news stations began calling Jules' phone, wanting to interview her about the incident. But she politely declined, understanding that the power of the story lay not in her commentary, but in its ability to speak for itself. By evening, the video had reached 50,000 views and had been picked up by several national news outlets. But instead of sensationalizing the conflict, the coverage focused on the resolution, on the unexpected lesson in de-escalation and redemption that had played out in a small Colorado diner. Back at Wolfe's Lodge, Kara found herself dealing with an unexpected influx of visitors, not troublemakers drawn by viral notoriety, but people who'd seen the video and wanted to experience the kind of community that could transform conflict into healing. She served them coffee and pie with the same warmth she'd always shown, but she noticed something different in their faces, a hunger for the kind of authentic human connection they'd witnessed in Jules's video. Steven Seagal had quietly left town that morning, disappearing as silently as he'd arrived. But his presence lingered in the diner like an echo, reminding everyone who'd witnessed his intervention that true strength was measured not by the fear you could inspire but by the peace you could create. Eli Morgan found himself receiving visitors throughout the day, not fans seeking autographs but young people who'd seen the video and wanted to understand how someone could respond to cruelty with such grace. He welcomed them all, sharing stories not of his own heroism but of the ordinary courage required to choose kindness in a world that often rewarded its opposite. "The hardest battles aren't fought with weapons," he told a group of teenagers who'd driven up from Denver after seeing the video. "They're fought in moments like this, when you have to choose between the easy path and the right path, between what feels good and what does good." Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Logan Trent sat at his kitchen table reading the comments on Jules's video. Many were supportive of his transformation, celebrating his choice to change. But others were less forgiving, questioning whether someone who'd behaved so cruelly deserved redemption, whether change was really possible for people who'd caused so much harm. The criticism stung, but Logan found himself oddly grateful for it. It reminded him that transformation wasn't a one-time event, but an ongoing process, that earning redemption required more than a single moment of clarity. It required consistent action, daily choices to be better, the patience to prove through behavior rather than words that change was genuine and lasting. He picked up his phone and called the local VA hospital, asking about volunteer opportunities. The conversation was awkward. He had no relevant experience, no particular skills, no background that suggested he'd be helpful. But something in his voice, some quality of sincere desire to contribute rather than take, convinced the coordinator to give him a chance. "We can always use help with transportation," she said. "Driving veterans to appointments, helping with errands. It's not glamorous work, but it's needed." "That's perfect," Logan said and meant it. He understood now that redemption wasn't found in grand gestures but in the accumulation of small services. in the daily choice to be useful rather than destructive. As he hung up the phone, Logan looked out his window toward the mountains where Wolfe's lodge sat nestled among the aspens. The video had made him briefly famous, but fame wasn't what he was after. He wanted something far more valuable and far more difficult to achieve, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his presence in the world made it marginally better rather than worse. The digital ripples from Jules's video continued to spread, carrying with them a message that the internet rarely propagated, that conflict could be transformed into connection, that enemies could become allies, that the most viral content wasn't always about destruction and division, but sometimes about the harder, more important work of building bridges and healing wounds. In a world hungry for authentic examples of redemption and grace, the story of what happened at Wolfe's Lodge Diner offered something precious. Proof that change was possible, that forgiveness was powerful, and that sometimes the strongest response to hatred was the simple refusal to hate in return. 2 weeks after the incident at Wolfe's Lodge Diner, the autumn air in Eagle Rock carried the crisp promise of winter. The aspens had shed most of their golden leaves, leaving behind stark branches that reached toward gray skies like fingers, searching for redemption. It was on one of these quiet October mornings that Eli Morgan made his weekly pilgrimage to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in nearby Glenwood Springs, a routine that had become as essential to his well-being as his morning coffee and evening prayers. The VA hospital was a study in institutional efficiency, tempered by human compassion. Long corridors lined with wheelchairs and walkers, bulletin boards covered with announcements for support groups and memorial services, walls decorated with photos of young soldiers from conflicts spanning 8 decades. Eli navigated these hallways with the familiarity of someone who'd spent years visiting friends whose bodies had been broken by service and whose spirits were slowly being mended by community. He was heading toward the physical therapy wing to visit Tommy Kowalski, no relation to the Jimmy Kowalski from his Vietnam unit, but a young Marine who'd lost his left leg to an IED in Afghanistan and was learning to walk again with the stubborn determination that seemed to be issued along with dress blues. Eli had been visiting Tommy for 6 months now, part of a volunteer program that paired older veterans with younger ones, creating bridges across generations of service and sacrifice. As he rounded the corner toward the therapy rooms, Eli stopped, short. Through the large windows that allowed natural light into the rehabilitation area, he could see something that made him question whether his eyes were playing tricks on him. There, bent over a set of parallel bars, was Logan Trent. Not the swaggering aggressor who'd terrorized a diner full of innocent people, but a young man focused intently on helping an elderly veteran take halting steps between the rails. Logan's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the aggressive posture, the need to dominate space and attention. Instead, he moved with quiet efficiency, his hands ready to provide support without hovering, his voice offering encouragement without false cheerfulness. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, and his previously elaborate hairstyle had been trimmed to something more practical, less performative. The veteran Logan was helping was Arthur Mendez, a Korean, war survivor in his 80s whose hip replacement had left him unsteady on his feet. Eli had known Arthur for years, understood his pride and independence, knew how difficult it must be for him to accept help from someone young enough to be his great-grandson. But as Eli watched through the window, he saw something remarkable. Arthur was smiling, actually joking with Logan as they worked through the exercises. "Come on, Mr. Mendez," Logan was saying, his voice carrying none of the mocking tone Eli remembered from their confrontation. "You've got this. Just think about all the mountains you climbed in Korea. This is just a really short, really boring mountain." Arthur chuckled, his weathered hands gripping the parallel bars with renewed determination. "You remind me of my drill sergeant," he said. "Same smart mouth, but at least you're not trying to get me killed." Logan's laugh was genuine, free of the performative cruelty that had characterized his behavior 2 weeks earlier. "Different kind of service," he said. "Same goal, though, getting you back on your feet and ready to take on the world." Eli stood transfixed, watching this interaction play out. In his 78 years, he'd learned to be skeptical of sudden transformations, to distinguish between genuine change and theatrical performance. Too many people talked about being different without doing the daily work that actual change required. But there was something about Logan's presence in this moment that spoke to authenticity. The way he anticipated Arthur's needs without being asked the patient repetition of exercises, the complete absence of any audience to impress. This wasn't performance. This was service. As if sensing he was being observed, Logan glanced toward the window and spotted Eli. For a moment their eyes met across the glass, and Eli saw something in the young man's face that completed his transformation in ways that words never could. Have, not shame or defensiveness, but quiet acknowledgement. Logan nodded slightly, not the exaggerated gesture of someone seeking approval, but the simple recognition that passed between people who understood each other. Eli nodded back, a small gesture that carried the weight of forgiveness, acceptance, and something approaching pride. Then Logan turned his attention back to Arthur, and Eli continued on his way to visit Tommy, carrying with him the profound satisfaction of witnessing redemption in action. Later, as Eli sat with Tommy in the therapy room, helping the young Marine with his exercises, he found himself reflecting on the strange geometry of healing. 2 weeks ago, Logan had been a source of pain and humiliation. Today, he was helping other veterans recover from their own battles with disability and loss. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was generational, creating connections between past and present that strengthened both. "You seem different today, Mr. Morgan," Tommy observed as they worked through a series of balance exercises. "Lighter somehow," Eli smiled, thinking about the framed photograph that now sat on his dresser at home, its tape scars visible but somehow beautiful in their evidence of survival and reconstruction. "Just remembering that broken things can heal stronger than they were before," he said, "and that sometimes the best way to help yourself is to help someone else." As he prepared to leave the hospital that afternoon, Eli made a detour past the volunteer coordinator's office. The woman behind the desk looked up with the harried expression of someone managing too many schedules with too few resources. "Mrs. Patterson," Eli said, "I wanted to ask about that young man who's been helping with transportation and therapy assistance. Logan Trent?" Her expression softened immediately. "Oh, Logan's been wonderful. Shows up early, stays late, never complains about the work. The veterans love him. He's got a way of making them feel like they're helping him instead of the other way around." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Eli said. But he was thinking about second chances, about the courage required to show up day after day without fanfare or recognition, about the kind of quiet heroism that never made headlines, but changed lives nonetheless. That evening, as Eli sat in his usual spot at Wolfe's Lodge Diner, he shared the story with Kara while she refilled his coffee. The viral video had brought a steady stream of visitors to the diner, people curious about the place where such a remarkable transformation had occurred. But the real story, Eli realized, wasn't the dramatic confrontation that had been captured on camera. It was the daily choice to be better, the unglamorous work of earning redemption through service, the quiet test of whether change was genuine or merely performative. Logan Trent was passing that test, one veteran at a time, one day at a time, one small act of service at a time. And in doing so, he was discovering something that Eli had learned in the jungles of Vietnam, that the most profound strength came not from the ability to defeat others, but from the willingness to lift them up, to stand between them and their struggles, to be the kind of person who made the world slightly better simply by being in it. The quiet test was ongoing, would continue for the rest of Logan's life. But based on what Eli had witnessed at the VA hospital, the young man was well on his way to becoming the kind of person who could look at himself in the mirror without flinching, who could sleep at night knowing that his presence in the world was a gift rather than a burden. It was, Eli reflected as he watched the sun set behind the Colorado peaks, exactly the kind of victory that Steven Seagal had made possible 2 weeks earlier, not through violence or dominance, but through the simple recognition that everyone deserved a chance to be better than their worst moment, and that sometimes all it took was someone willing to stand witness to that possibility. The first snow of the season dusted the peaks around Eagle Rock like powdered sugar on a baker's masterpiece, transforming the landscape into something both familiar and magical. 6 weeks had passed since the incident at Wolfe's Lodge Diner, and the video Jules Hernandez had captured continued to ripple outward through digital channels, accumulating views and comments that suggested people were hungry for stories of redemption and transformation in a world that seemed increasingly divided. The statistics were remarkable. 3 million views across all platforms, 47,000 shares, comments in 17 languages, and most surprisingly, the video had inspired a grassroots movement that its creators never could have anticipated. Real Strength Challenge had begun trending, with people sharing their own stories of choosing de-escalation over confrontation, forgiveness over revenge, building up over tearing down. But for the people actually involved in the original incident, the numbers were less important than the daily reality of living changed lives. Logan Trent had settled into a routine that would have been unrecognizable to the angry young man who'd stormed into the diner 6 weeks earlier. His days began at 5 a.m. with a drive to the VA hospital, where he helped transport veterans to appointments, assisted with physical therapy sessions, and provided whatever support was needed. His evenings were spent in community college classes, working toward a degree in social work with a focus on veteran services. The transformation wasn't always easy. There were days when the old anger surfaced, when he caught himself falling back into patterns of resentment and blame. But those moments were increasingly rare, tempered by the daily evidence that his life had meaning beyond his own pain, that his hands could heal instead of harm, that his presence could bring comfort instead of fear. On this particular morning, Logan was helping Arthur Mendez with his weekly grocery shopping when they encountered a familiar face in the produce section of the local market. Eli Morgan stood examining apples with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to find pleasure in simple things. His distinguished service cross visible on his jacket, the framed photograph of his Vietnam unit tucked safely in his wallet. "Mr. Morgan," Logan said, his voice carrying the respectful tone that had replaced his earlier aggression. "How are you doing?" Eli looked up, his face breaking into the kind of genuine smile that had become more frequent in recent weeks. "Logan, good to see you. Arthur, how's the hip treating you?" The three men fell into easy conversation, discussing Arthur's progress in physical therapy, Logan's classes, Eli's volunteer work at the local hospice. To any observer, they would have appeared to be exactly what they were: 3 generations of men who'd found common ground in service and mutual respect. There was no tension, no awkwardness, no residual anger from their dramatic first meeting. It was, Logan realized, exactly the kind of ordinary interaction that had seemed impossible 6 weeks earlier. He'd spent so many years seeing the world through the lens of conflict and dominance that he'd forgotten how to simply exist alongside other people, without needing to prove anything or take anything or defend against anything. As they prepared to part ways, Eli placed a gentle hand on Logan's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son," he said simply, "not just for what you're doing, but for who you're becoming." The words hit Logan with unexpected force. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had expressed pride in him, couldn't recall when someone had seen potential in him rather than threat. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and watched as Eli continued his shopping with the unhurried pace of someone who'd learned to savor ordinary moments. Later that afternoon, as Logan was finishing his shift at the VA hospital, he received a text message from an unknown number. "Would you be interested in speaking to some kids about making better choices? Local high school. Nothing fancy, just sharing your story. Steven." Logan stared at the message for a long moment, understanding immediately who had sent it, despite the lack of a last name. Steven Seagal had maintained his distance since the UE incident, allowing Logan's transformation to unfold without interference or supervision. But apparently, he'd been watching, waiting for the right moment to suggest the next step in Logan's journey. The idea of speaking to teenagers about his experiences terrified Logan in ways that facing down armed opponents never had. Standing in front of a group of young people, many of whom might be struggling with their own anger and pain, and admitting to the kind of cruelty he'd once embodied, It seemed like a special kind of vulnerability that his old self would never have risked. But that was exactly why it was necessary. Yes, he typed back. When? The response came immediately. Tomorrow afternoon, Westside High School, 3 p.m. Just tell them what you learned. The next day, Logan found himself standing in front of 37 teenagers in a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and adolescent anxiety. Many of them looked like younger versions of his former self, angry, defensive, convinced that the world had nothing to offer them but disappointment and betrayal. Their faces reflected his own journey, the need to be tough, to never show weakness, to strike before being struck. I want to tell you about the worst thing I ever did, Logan began, his voice steady despite his nervousness, and about the best thing that ever happened to me because of it. He told them about the diner, about his cruelty to Eli, about the moment when Seagal had shown him a different way to be strong. He talked about the daily choice to be better, about the satisfaction of helping others, about the discovery that respect couldn't be taken but only earned through consistent action. The students listened with the kind of attention that suggested his words were reaching them in places where adult lectures usually couldn't penetrate. When he finished, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "What if you've already hurt people?" she asked. "What if you've already done things that can't be undone?" Logan looked at her, seeing himself in her guarded expression, understanding the weight of regret that carried in her question. "Then you start from where you are," he said. "You can't undo the past, but you can choose what happens next. Every single day you get to choose what kind of person you're going to be, and the people you help in the future won't care about who you used to be. They'll only care about who you choose to be for them." After the presentation, Logan drove back to Eagle Rock, taking the winding mountain road that led past Wolfe's Lodge Diner. The parking lot was busier than usual. The viral video had turned the little restaurant into an unexpected tourist destination, a place where people came hoping to witness the kind of transformation they'd seen online. As Logan parked and walked toward the entrance, he spotted a familiar figure sitting alone in a corner booth. Seagal looked exactly as he had 6 weeks earlier, calm, observant, radiating the kind of quiet strength that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. He looked up as Logan approached, nodding toward the empty seat across from him. "How did it go?" Stephen asked, his voice carrying the same measured tone Logan remembered from their first encounter. "Scary," Logan admitted, sliding into the booth. "But good. I think they heard me." Stephen smiled, the expression transforming his face in ways that made him look both younger and older. "The scared part means you're taking it seriously. The good part means you're doing it right." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men who'd found common ground in the shared understanding that strength wasn't about dominance but about service. That true power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. "What's next?" Logan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "What's next is tomorrow," Stephen said simply. "And the day after that. And the day after that. You keep showing up, keep making the choice to be better, keep proving to yourself and everyone else that change is possible." As Stephen prepared to leave, disappearing as quietly as he'd appeared 6 weeks earlier, he placed a hand on Logan's shoulder in a gesture that mirrored Eli's earlier blessing. "Remember," he said, "stillness is strength. The quietest victories are often the most lasting ones." Logan watched through the diner window as Stephen walked to his car and drove away, understanding that their paths might never cross again but that the lesson would stay with him forever. Around him, the diner hummed with the conversations of people who'd come seeking something: inspiration, hope, proof that redemption was possible in a world that often seemed determined to tear itself apart. Jules Hernandez appeared at his table with a cup of coffee and a knowing smile. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. "I've been thinking about doing a follow-up video, but I wanted to ask permission first." Logan considered the request, understanding that his story no longer belonged entirely to him. It had become part of something larger, a narrative that gave people hope in their own capacity for change and growth. Only if you focus on the work, he said finally. Not the drama of what happened, but the daily choice to be better. That's the real story. Jules nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The viral video had captured a moment of transformation, but the real victory was in the unglamorous work that followed. The early mornings at the VA hospital, the community college classes, the high school presentations, the daily decision to be someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Outside the diner, snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing Eagle Rock in pristine white that would cover the scars of autumn and prepare the ground for spring's renewal. Inside, Logan Trent sat surrounded by the quiet hum of community. No longer the angry young man who'd stormed through these doors 6 weeks earlier, but someone who'd learned that the strongest response to a broken world wasn't to break it further, but to help put the pieces back together, one small act of service at a time. The transformation was complete, but the work would continue for the rest of his life. And Logan had finally learned to find strength not in the fight, but in the stillness that followed, in the quiet certainty that he'd chosen to become someone worthy of the grace he'd been shown. In the end, that was the real victory. Not the viral video or the dramatic confrontation, but the simple daily choice to be better than you were the day before, to help instead of harm, to build instead of tear down, to be the kind of person who made the world a little brighter simply by being in it. The snow continued to fall, covering everything in fresh possibilities, and Logan Trent sat in the warmth of community, finally understanding what Seagal had tried to teach him from the beginning. That stillness was strength. That quiet service was the highest form of courage, and that the most powerful victories were often the ones that nobody saw coming. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.